Okay, so over a couple of decades of trying to get better at everything from lifting weights to making friends, I've read dozens and dozens of books on self-improvement, and then a bunch more on Kindle. And the thing is, whether those books are aimed at samurai or salesmen or people who want to get better at tennis, the same lessons come up again and again and again. And so in this video, I'm going to break all of that down into a 7-step framework that I think can really improve your life, starting with little things and then moving on to bigger ones. But to start all that, I think it makes the most sense to talk about starting things. And I mean, obviously, you have to start things to have any chance of succeeding at them, but that means different things in a couple of different situations. And so this kind of breaks down into a couple of different areas, which are starting small daily tasks and starting big, life-changing projects. And it's worth bearing in mind that these two do have things in common, so if you get better at one, you will get better at both. And so what I've found most helpful for small daily tasks is a combination of first thing thinking and eating the frog. Eating the frog is pretty simple. For me, it just means identifying the one thing that you want to accomplish more than anything else in that day and doing that first. Whether that's pitching an article, emailing someone with an interview request, or talking to your accountant. And then first thing thinking is about breaking down any task you have into smaller and smaller chunks until you've got one really clear first thing that you can get going on immediately. So for instance, if I need to email an expert for a piece I'm writing, the first thing on my list isn't do the interview or book it in, it's creating a reading list of information on the topic to see who the experts in the space are. Having a clear first thing makes it easier to take action, and taking action is one of the best ways to overcome inertia on bigger projects. But when it comes to life-changing projects, you're going to have to overcome what Julien Smith calls the flinch and Stephen Pressfield calls resistance. And this is the sort of pushback that kicks in whenever you want to do something really life-changing, because the lizard part of your brain is scared of anything in your life actually changing. And every author has their own suggested ways of overcoming this, but what all of them agree on is that the most important thing is to do something, getting a first draft or a rough cut or whatever out, and then fixing that later. So for instance, in Creativity Inc., which is about Pixar's process, Finding Nemo director Andrew Stanton says that people need to be wrong as fast as they can. In a battle, he says, if you're faced with two hills and you're unsure which one to attack, the best thing to do is hurry up and attack one of them. If it turns out to be wrong, you can always turn around and go in the other direction. But you don't really want to have to begin this process of overcoming inertia every day, which is why it's so important to start building habits. So if you're watching this video, you probably already know that habits dictate a lot of your life. There's one famous study that says 40% of everything we do in a typical day is habit, and so not surprisingly, a ton of self-improvement books focus on the importance of building these habits. There's a passage I really like in Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird, where her father talks about writing fiction as something you should practice like doing scales on the piano. It's not something you save for when you're in the mood, it's just something that you get daily reps in. And there's tons of habit forming advice out there, but there are two specific things that have helped me. The first one is Charles Duhigg's idea of a habit loop, which is where we identify a cue that tells our brain to go into automatic mode and go into a routine that we've come to rely on, which gives us a reward that helps our brain figure out whether the loop is worth remembering. And so the idea here is that once we've identified the cue and the reward, we can replace the habit with something else. Like instead of having a muffin as a pick-me-up in the afternoon, we can go for a short walk away from our desk, which gives us the same feeling of feeling energized without like the sugar crash afterwards. And then the second thing that I really like is habit stacking, which was actually invented by a guy called BJ Fogg, but then popularized by James Clear's Atomic Habits, where he talks about the value of pairing new habits with existing things that you're already used to doing. So for instance, maybe when you brush your teeth in the morning, you also do 20 press-ups, or when you make your first morning coffee, you also wipe down all the surfaces in your kitchen. Basically, habits are the building blocks of the kind of life that you're going to have, so it makes sense to take time and make them good ones. But it's also useful to think about creating systems. And so I think of systems as a kind of next level up from habits. They're a set of like rules or processes that you follow when the situation's too complex to do the same thing every time. So maybe the simplest example of a system is what Anders Ericsson calls if-then thinking in his book Peak, where you have a simple rule set up for a thing that happens occasionally. So for me, a really good example is working out. If I can't go to the gym on lower body day for whatever reason, then I already have a simple lower body routine I can do at home, and I don't need to worry about what it's going to be because I already have it set in place. And then a slightly more complex example of systems is having checklists. I'd really recommend Atul Gawand's Checklist Manifesto for this, but the short version is that as the world gets more complex, checklists are becoming increasingly important to make sure everything gets done and nobody misses anything. So a good checklist is short, contains clear language and might include 5 to 9 items. You can use what's called a read-do checklist, where you literally go down the list and check them off. But if I'm making a video, for instance, I'll often use what's called a do-confirm list, where I do all the steps that I know I need to, and then I'll check off the checklist afterwards to make sure that I haven't missed anything, which is really helpful. And then the most complex form of system is one that I've only been using pretty recently, since I read a book called The E-Myth Revisited, where the core argument is that even small business owners need systems in place that allow them to scale up without just working themselves to the bone all the time. I think of this as the franchise model because it's what businesses like Starbucks and McDonald's use to make sure they can train people very quickly and ensure they deliver the same standard of service basically everywhere. But it's still something you can use on your own, or even if you're just working with 1 or 2 people. And it kind of combines if-then thinking and checklist. So for me, when I edit videos, a couple of my simple rules are that titles are always in Futura, and any titles more than 2 words long are printed in lowercase. This makes my life simpler because I don't have to think about these things, but it also means that if I work with an editor, it's easy for them to work in a style that makes the videos look consistent. And this also helps with another thing that I try to do from day to day, making regular, tiny improvements. So this is something that comes up in a ton of different places. The most formal version of it is Kaizen, which basically means constantly trying to make tiny improvements in whatever you're doing. It's a really common theme in YouTube advice, where there are like a ton of tiny things that you could do to make your channel better in a myriad of ways every day. Whether that's like your scripting, your lighting, your thumbnails, or the way you record sound. But it also comes up as a theme in one of my favorite books of all time, 9 out of 10 climbers make the same mistakes, where Dave McLeod talks about breaking the skill of climbing down into a bunch of different areas so you can improve rapidly at the ones where you're weakest. This is something you can do with basically any skill, and I've done a whole video up here about how to do it, so I do recommend taking a look at that. But it's also important to recognize that things aren't always going to go the way you want, which is why it's important to think about building the skill of resilience. Because the thing is, nothing's ever as simple as you expect it to be. And a big part of self-improvement is having the tools in place to deal with setbacks without getting too discouraged. Or as Winston Churchill puts it, success consists of going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. So some of the best books on building resilience are obviously by the Stoic philosophers, and I really recommend Marcus Aurelius' Meditations and Seneca's On the Shortness of Life for advice on reframing problems as challenges and not worrying about things you can't control. But I also think it's helpful to try and build resilience in other ways. For instance, in his collection of essays Strong Enough, Mark Ripperto writes, intentionally placing yourself in the position of having to complete a task when you don't know if you can is the single best way of preparing to be in that position unintentionally. What Ripperto means by that is going to the gym. Because honestly, 20 rep squats are one of the most unpleasant things you can intentionally force yourself to do. But really, I think any kind of demanding physical activity does the same thing. And then there's a sort of higher tier version of building resilience, which Nicholas Taleb explains in Anti-Fragile, which is the idea that instead of just being strong enough to cope when unexpected chaos strikes, you actually get stronger when things go wrong. One example he gives is thinking about a taxi driver. A taxi driver's wages can go up and down over time, but on average he's more resilient against economic chaos than someone with a full-time job because he can't be fired. By the way, obviously being a taxi driver in New York was a lot more stable as a profession before Uber came along and upended the entire industry, which is an example of the sort of black swan event that Nicholas Taleb talks about in another book of his, but that's probably a subject for another video. And so being anti-fragile really means building up systems in your life that allow you to succeed when everything turns into unexpected chaos, which for me means being adaptable, having a lot of different skills, and being able to learn new things when I need to. But it also means focusing when you have to. So a skill that's increasingly important in the modern world is the ability to focus when all the dozens of things that have been kind of precision designed to distract you are all going on around you. And there are a bunch of books dealing with that. Blaise Pascal was talking about this in the 17th century, but people were devising strategies for it long before that. One of the most common bits of advice to stop you from checking your phone is to put it in another room or somewhere inaccessible. And that's basically what Odysseus does with the sirens in the Odyssey. For me though, I think the simplest thing that works is being intentional about how you spend your time. Whether that's periods of what some people call focused deep work, or catching up on emails and social media, or your leisure time. So for instance, when I work, I set a timer and do focused 25-minute bursts of work where I won't really let anything else distract me. And then I like to batch up my time on emails and social media. I also really like a bit of advice I read from Carl Newport, which is to try and avoid hitting the like button. You either care enough about a comment somebody's made to provide a thought through response that they'll enjoy, or you don't need to engage with it. And then finally, I think it's also important to be intentional about your downtime. For instance, I've talked in another video about how scientists recognise the importance of percolation for ideas. If you're working hard on something, you might need to go for a walk with no phone just to let the ideas work their way through your mind. But focus is even something you can bring to your time off. By setting times when you're going to intentionally step away from your work, ignore your emails, put your phone in a drawer and watch a movie, play a game, or play with your kids. And that all brings us to being nice to yourself. This isn't actually something that comes up a lot, and reading enough self-improvement books can give you the idea that there's this whole world of people out there who are just grinding and hustling and getting things done. But one of the most important things to recognise is that it's actually all a process, and there's no real value in beating yourself up over mistakes. Again, something that's really valuable here is stoicism, which at its core is about not worrying about the things we can't control, but also recognising that the stories we tell ourselves can be responsible for some of our lowest moments. And it's definitely worth reading some Aurelius or Derren Brown's Happy, which covers a lot of the same territory, to remind yourself that constantly chasing things isn't really a recipe for happiness. I'd also recommend Oliver Burkeman's 4,000 Weeks to remind yourself that not everything has to be about productivity and improvement. The idea that we should be constantly striving to better ourselves and level up our lives is actually kind of a relatively recent invention, and there's nothing wrong with just enjoying leisure time. It doesn't have to be like something that you only do to recharge yourself for the next bit of grinding and hustling. And finally, remember, wherever you are in your self-improvement journey, there are always things you can bring to the world. One of my favourite books of all time is Range by David Epstein, and a point he makes in that is that this isn't really a world that benefits specialists anymore. It's about generalists who can combine their insights and expertise in interesting ways to come up with new insights and inventions. It's one of the best arguments I've ever seen for following your own interests and not feeling like success has to come on a timescale, and if you'd like to learn more about that, I've done a whole video about it here. Thanks for watching.